Hey guys, it's Keith Foskey, and you can tell by the way I'm dressed that we're having another one of our patent pending bow tie dialogues. What is a bow tie dialogue? Well, this is an opportunity for me to invite someone on the show who comes from a different perspective than I hold to. And we're going to talk about what they believe, why they believe it, and ultimately maybe have a conversation about what some of our differences are. But to do so, hopefully, as brothers and friends. And today I want to welcome Eric Hernandez to the show, and we're going to be talking about the subject of Molinism. Eric, good morning, and thank you for coming on your Calvinist podcast.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And for anyone who doesn't know you, I know you have a pretty good YouTube presence, but for anyone who doesn't know you, can you tell us a little bit about your ministry, your background? I know I've seen a few of your videos. I've seen your debate with Matt Dillahunty, which I think went really well, the one about the soul. But tell folks who you are and what you do.
My name's Eric Hernandez. Run a nonprofit called EHM Apologetics. We exist to equip believers and reach skeptics. And our slogan is to plant seeds and pull weeds. You know, the planting seed aspect refers to evangelism, and the pulling weeds refers to responding to objections a person may have when it comes to engaging and sharing the gospel. I like to say I'm an apologist because I'm an evangelist. I have a heart for the lost. I have a heart for equipping the body of Christ and reaching them. And at the same time, you know, I think theology matters, philosophy matters, as I'm sure we both agree. And there are differences I have with other people who I would consider brothers and sisters in Christ. And it's great to be able to have cordial dialogues on these issues.
Do you think that in our modern day that evangelism requires more apologetics than maybe it did 50 years ago in one respect with all of the advent of technology and questions that come at us when we're sharing Jesus with folks?
Yeah, great question. Yes, and I think it's always required apologetics, and I think the fact that we hadn't used it ended up, you know, the church as a whole ended up shooting itself in the foot in the
Mm,
long run, because you know if to not go too long, let's just say that you know if I share my quote unquote conversion story with someone and they're moved on the basis of my kindness and generosity and benevolence, then I would say, you know, they might be starting on the wrong foot as to why they're quote unquote converting. Because if they're converting on the basis of look how nice this person is to me, well, my goodness, if a Mormon would have reached them first, and they would have went to Mormonism. So even these conversions, assuming that they're truly converting, I think of it like this, and I say this in my book, The Lazy Approach to Evangelism, shameless plug back there, um, is if, you know, what I find is today the quote unquote gospel pitch when we try to witness to people is not necessarily become a Christian because it's true, but it's more like become a Christian because look at how great my life is, look at my marriage and whatnot, and this is my story, and the implication, whether intentional or not, seems to be if you become a Christian, you get these things too. Well, first of all, that's not the gospel. Second, I cannot guarantee that for anyone. And third, I'm setting the person up with this mentality, not that you exist to serve God, but God exists to serve you. And then what this ends up doing is setting unbiblical, theologically false expectations. And then in the future, when they hit something that, you know, maybe, let's say, debilitating for them in their mind, God failed them. And you know, if they study the doctrines of Christianity and they figure out that this isn't about my happiness, well, then it makes sense to find a different religion if that was the basis of conversion to begin with. So, sure, about 50 plus years ago, people were maybe more accepting of scripture and religious views, but that doesn't mean that we had to skip over loving God with our mind, because that is part of the greatest commandment. And I think that we should have been giving people more solid reasons for Christianity to begin with, whether or not the culture was asking for it or not. We are still called to love God with our heart, soul, mind, our intellect, and strength.
awesome. Wonderful. And one more question before we move into the heart of our discussion, and that is, are you a pastor of a church? This is one thing I didn't know about you. Are you pastoring, or is this ministry your main part of ministry, or do you have a local church that you pastor?
I'm part of a local church, but I don't pastor. Some years
Okay.
ago, I was a young adults pastor, and then I would help with the youth before that. But no, it's for about the past 7 years, I was the apologetics lead and millennial specialist for Texas Baptist. That department got dissolved in October of 2025. And after lots of prayer and, talking with some people and getting some wise counsel, I felt the Lord tell me to start a nonprofit and continue full-time ministry. So I told the Lord, okay, I'll do that. But first, you need to talk to my wife. And second, you need to provide the funds. And the Lord did that. So I'm blown away by what he's done.
Amen. And I want to commend you for talking to your wife. That is something I think sometimes guys run full speed ahead and don't seek the counsel of their wives. So praise the Lord for that. Praise the Lord that you have a good and solid marriage, and that she obviously supported you in that. So that's an encouragement. Hey guys, I just wanted to take a minute to remind you that this podcast is a ministry of Sovereign Grace Family Church. So if you're in the Jacksonville, Florida area, come and visit us, and you can learn more at sgfcjax.org. Also, I want to remind you of our important podcast partners, including Tiny Bibles. Tiny Bibles produces the smallest printed Bible on the market today, and it's available in the King James, the New King James, and the New American Standard Version. And if you use my name, Keith, in the coupon code, you'll get a discount. Are you a coffee drinker? Well, Squirrely Joe's Coffee has the best coffee in the world, and it's available to be shipped directly to your home. And if you'd like to check out Squirrely Joe's Coffee, go to squirrelyjoes.com/yourcalvinist, and they will send you a free bag. All you have to do is pay for the shipping. And if you want to buy more, use my name, Keith, in the coupon code, and you'll get a discount. Are you interested in getting stronger and more physically fit? Well, High Calling Fitness offers strength training and nutrition coaching from confessionally reformed strength athletes, and it's all brought to you right through your computer. So look at the description in this video to find out how to contact them to start your journey to a healthier you. And finally, I want to mention Dominion Wealth Strategists. I'm going to have a video that comes up in a little while that shows how they can serve you. So when we talk about our main topic of today, I want to set the ground for why I invited you to come on. And you know this, but obviously the audience doesn't. About a week or two ago, I was invited to go to an event with Frank Turek. You know Frank Turek, right? The campus or the guy who goes to campuses and does apologetics. Are you familiar with him?
Yeah. I've become friends with Frank. He endorsed my book. Been on his podcast a couple of times. Yeah. Awesome guy.
Oh, great. Okay, wonderful. All right, so you know him. Well, Frank was in Jacksonville and had opportunity to meet him. Well, while I was there, I got to meet some of the on-campus students who do ministry on campus at UNF. There was the Ratio Christi guys. There was a few other groups that were there, and they were all very nice and very kind. And one of the young gentlemen invited me to one of their apologetics nights. So I went to the apologetics night, and that particular night, he was giving a talk on non-identity theodicy. Now, that's not what we're talking about today. That's a whole other topic. And if anybody wants to spend some time Googling that, go ahead and go do that. But he was talking about non-identity theodicy, and he kept referencing the fact that I was a Calvinist. Now, there was only about 20 people in the room, so it wasn't like it was a huge group, and he knew me. So he was like, well, Calvinists would say this, and I know we have at least one with us tonight. And he kept pointing at me. I was like, well, thanks, dude. I appreciate that. And he wasn't being mean. He was just, referencing the fact that what he was saying would have agreement with some of what Calvinism would say. Like some of his arguments I would not be opposed to. And so this led to he and I having about a 2-hour conversation after the show about our perspective on providence and our perspective on how God works out his will in the world. And come to find out, he himself was a Molinist. And so that led to the conversation of, is Molinism determinism? And I was kind of coming to the conclusion based on what he was saying that it seemed like it really is a form of just another form of determinism. And so that got me wanting to have a conversation with someone, and I would have had him on the show, but I decided to reach out to my friend Andrew Rappaport, who, if you don't know Andrew, I know you do, but for the people who don't know, Andrew Rappaport knows everybody. And if you ever need to get a hold of anybody, Andrew Rappaport is the guy. And so I reached out and I said, hey, do you know anyone who is an expert in Molinism? And he recommended you. So that's how we came together, for anyone who's interested in knowing how this conversation came about. And I called you and I said, hey, I need you to come on this week because this is on my mind. Like, I don't want to put this off for 6 months. And you were gracious enough to do that, even though you're still dealing with your move. So thank you for that.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me. It's an honor.
Yeah. So with all that in mind, I want to start with the simple, basic question, and this is for everybody in the audience who doesn't even know Luis de Molina or Molinism or any of that stuff. Can you give us the bird's eye view? What is Molinism, and what is the problem that Molinism is attempting to solve? So take it away and spend as much time as you think is needful. And we are going to get to the question of the 3 types of knowledge. You can use that in this now, or we can wait on that. It's up to you.
Yeah, well, when I usually explain this to people, I kind of like ask them a couple questions. So if you don't mind, we can do that just to see if they're quote unquote Molinist. So I like to ask, let's just jump right in. I'll say, so do you think, for example, Keith, that God? Well, first I'd say, do you think God is omniscient? He knows all true propositions and believes no false ones. Which for the listeners, he knows all true statements, does not believe any false statements. Would you agree to that?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, yeah, and most Christians do. We do have open theist friends, and I pray for them. But so yes, God knows all things. And then I'd ask, do you think God knows what your life would have been like had you had one more sister, or one more brother, or one less sibling?
I think that the answer of does God know what would have happened in a different set of circumstances? Yes, I could affirm that as on a theoretical, or maybe we could say not potential level, but on the level of if it were this hypothetical. That's the word I was looking for. Thank you.
Sure,
Yes,
yeah.
I could consider that on a hypothetical level. Yes.
Yeah, and these aren't, and just to even clarify for the audience, these aren't like gotcha questions. This is just to kind of help the person wrap their mind around it. And then I say, okay, do you think God knew this logically prior to creating anything?
Well, yeah, because his knowledge is not bound in time. Sure.
Right. So then I would say then on that basis, you're essentially a Molinist. Now, of course, one can reflect further and say, okay, actually, no, let me change my answer to this one after some reflection, which is fine. That's why I say it's not a gotcha, but that's the I would say the essence of Molinism is that God not just knows what could happen and what will happen, but what would have happened in a different set of circumstances. And he knew this logically prior to creation. I say logically prior because there was no time prior to creation. So the prior is not temporally prior in time, but rather logically prior. Like, for example, the number 1 comes before the number 2. But if we were to just say that God created numbers, it's not like he had to create them in order, so to speak. He would create them all at once. So although the number 1 and number 2 were created simultaneously, let's say, there is still a logical priority of order where 1 comes before 2. So, okay.
Sure, and I just want to jump in right there. I don't mean to interrupt you, but this is there's a good analogy to this in Calvinism, where I know you and I would disagree on this, but I think this might just further and get across your point. For instance, we would say that regeneration is logically prior to faith, where you would say faith is logically prior to regeneration, but neither of us would say they happen temporally separate. That you get regenerated on Thursday and then you believe on a Friday, or you believe on a Friday and get regenerated on a Saturday. We would both believe those things happen concurrently, but not that. But one, from our different perspectives, it would be one is logically prior to the other.
Sorry, I was reading there. Yeah, exactly. That's really good. I like that. So yeah, okay. So now let's go one layer deeper. And this now we would inevitably get into the what are called the 3 logical moments. So I would say at its core, Molinism is a view of God's omniscience. And so, like you asked earlier, what is Molinism trying to solve? And I get the question. I would say Molina in particular was trying to solve the problem of divine providence and human freedom, God's sovereignty and human freedom. But at its core, I would say Molinism is just essentially a view, an explication of God's omniscience. And so, excuse me, when we look then, again, just what Molinism entails or what it is, you see that historically speaking, there have always God's knowledge logically prior to creation has always been broken up in at least 2 logical moments. And the first would be, and there's different layers to this, but let's just say at first, logically prior to anything, and this doesn't mean that God's having to think through. This is us putting God's knowledge into categories. And first, we can say that everyone would agree that God has knowledge of everything that could happen. So this would be knowledge of all possibilities. Now, in philosophy, there's something known as possible world semantics. And what this means is it's not talking about a multiverse. It's talking about a hypothetical state of affairs. So, for example, is it logically possible for God to create a world in which unicorns existed, horses with one horn, instead of goats? Sure, it's logically possible. God could have done that. So then in the range of possibilities, we could say that God knows all the quote unquote possible worlds that he could create. And that would include worlds with goats or worlds with unicorns, worlds with both. These are all possibilities. And then out of all these possibilities, God decides which world he wants to create. And then once he makes his decision, then you have God's knowledge of what will happen. And this is quite literally God's foreknowledge. So once God decides out of all the possible worlds there are to create, and of course, again, just to reiterate for the audience, it's not as if God was deliberating. This is for us to understand. We're putting them in categories. Well, then now God chooses a world based on what he knows, and then creates what we call the actual world. So the world we live in is the actual world. It's not merely a possible world, it's the actual world. And then God knows what will happen. So far, just to recap, we have God's knowledge of all possible worlds, knowledge of God's knowledge of what could happen. And then and this is pre-volitional, pre-decision of which world to create. And then post-volitional, once he decides which world to create, you now have God's foreknowledge of what will happen. This is known as God's free knowledge. So the first category is known as God's natural knowledge. This is God's knowledge. This is God's knowledge that is natural to him, and it's God's knowledge of everything's nature. So God knows that if he puts H2O in a situation where it is 32 degrees Fahrenheit, then he knows it'll freeze because he knows the nature of water, and all this knowledge is natural to himself. So natural knowledge. And then the foreknowledge is called.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. I have to ask a question at that point because it just came into my mind. So we're saying that God knows that's what would happen. He didn't determine that it would be 32 degrees is when it would freeze, but that's natural outside of him.
So great question. So when it comes to a thing's nature, and this goes a little bit of a layer deeper, it would determine on what physical laws God put in place. So it's actually really good.
He's still determining the law that water freezes at 32. Because I've said water freezes at 32 degrees because that's what God determined. Would you disagree with that phrase?
Good question. So I'm not sure, and I'm not trying to be argumentative here. Because the reason I say that because I don't know enough about the chemistry to know, because it would seem that there are certain physical necessities, let's say. Now where those start and stop, I'm not sure. But let's go with the fact that given the nature of water in these circumstances, given the laws that God created, there would be certain things that happen necessarily. I don't mean metaphysical necessity, philosophical necessity. I mean, like for example, if I drop, something with gravity in this world, then it's going to fall given the laws of gravity. Nevertheless, but again, good question. But let's go with what you're saying, that God determined that. So if that's the case, then we would put that post-volitional. But all things being equal, God knows the nature of all things. This knowledge is natural to him. So natural knowledge is knowledge of what God's knowledge of what could happen. And these are possible worlds. Once God decides what world to create, it becomes God's free knowledge. That's what it's called. God's free knowledge. The reason it's called God's free knowledge is because I'm sure we would agree that God didn't have to create any world at all. So God's foreknowledge is called his free knowledge because it's knowledge based on his free decision to create anything at all. So that's where we're at so far. Any questions on that?
No, I think I'm clear so far. And again, I'm listening as if I were the audience to try to make sure. Obviously, I've thought about these things, but I want to know. I'm learning. I'm not saying I know everything, but I also want to think like the audience. So I think you've explained so well so far. If I've never heard of this, I think I'd be following you.
Okay, excellent. And then you have now. Because philosophers are not very creative. So we have God's natural knowledge and then God's free knowledge. And Molina posited a third category of knowledge that he put right between natural and free, and he called it God's middle knowledge. And I don't know, can I share my screen real quick? It's not a slide. I just put what I just talked about in a Word doc. So we have here, we talked about God's natural knowledge, God's knowledge of what could happen. These are possible worlds. Then you have God's free knowledge, God's knowledge of what will happen, foreknowledge of the actual world. And again, this is God's knowledge of what he freely decided to create. And then between natural and free, you have middle knowledge, God's knowledge of what would happen. And before I get to the feasible worlds application there. So with this in mind, let's say, I'll stop sharing there. Let's say that, let's assume for the sake of conversation that human beings have libertarian free will. Now, I would define libertarian free will as being the first mover of your will or actions. So if I raise my hand to vote and I did that and I was the initiator of this action, then I was the first mover. Thus, I would say I had libertarian free will. But if you were to shock me with a taser and that caused my arm to shoot up, well, I was not the cause of my arm shooting up. There was something prior and external to myself, namely the taser that made my arm go up. So in that instance, I did not act freely in the libertarian sense. Now, let's assume that human beings have libertarian free will. And what we can see here, and let me just go back to what we were looking at here is on God's, let's say, natural knowledge. He knows that, let's say, that Keith, it's logically possible that and hopefully it's not too personal. So when you were single, were you saved when you were single?
No, sir. I got saved when I was about 6 months into my marriage.
Okay. All right. So then this wouldn't apply. So my analogy wouldn't work. So what I would usually say is, let's say, or I'm trying to think of something. Let's just say in a hypothetical world that you were, let's say you're saved now. Let's say you're single in this possible world, if you will. Would you ever marry a non-believer?
Not if I was a Christian.
Okay, right. Yeah. So we know that, but let's ask this question. Is it logically possible for you to marry a non-believer if you're single and a Christian?
Sure. I know Christians who do it, even though I would say it's unwise and even sinful, but yeah.
Yeah, no, and I agree. So we could say in God's natural knowledge, he knows that if you were single and saved, then you could marry a believer or you could marry a non-believer, right? That's his natural knowledge. But then, given your free choice, if no matter what happens, you will not marry a non-believer, then now it goes from possible worlds to what we would call feasible worlds, meaning worlds that factor in what decisions you would make in that circumstance. So while it is possible you could marry a non-believer, God knows that given your free choice, you're going to marry a believer. So now we move from possible worlds, what merely could happen, to feasible worlds, what would happen. And now the feasible worlds are going to be limited to the worlds in which you marry believers. So this is also pre-volitional. God has not made a decision to create any world yet, but he's factoring in what you would freely do. So from natural knowledge, what could happen, possible worlds, then we go to middle knowledge, what would happen, feasible worlds, and then depending on whoever you chose, well, God is then going to choose a world, and then it becomes God's free knowledge based on his free decision to create the actual world. And that's kind of the gist in a nutshell of Molinism, that God is omniscient. Now, I would say that, and I wrote a paper for a class on this, that if we factor in perfect being theology, are you familiar with that, or your audience you think would be familiar with Anselm?
Go ahead and explain it just to make sure. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, and I love Anselm. He basically said that God is the greatest conceivable being that could possibly exist. If whatever your concept of God is, it's even greater than that. And the greatest thing you conceive of, that would be God. And if you were to find a view of God that is greater than the one you currently conceive of, then I would say, given what we know about God's nature, then you should abandon the lesser view of God and opt in for the greater view of God. So with this in mind, given maximal great being theology, perfect being theology, I would argue that a perfect being must possess middle knowledge. Omniscience, again, as we talked about earlier, is defined as knowing all true things and believing no false things. And the reason I was asking about, earlier, do you think God knows what your life would have been like with one or more sibling, or one less sibling? We say yes because I think we know naturally that God is omniscient and has always been omniscient. So I would say that a perfect being, a maximally great being, God, would have to possess mental knowledge. And given this view of omniscience, I would say that most naturally, then anyone who holds God in the highest esteem would hold to Molinism. Now, there's many ways we can go to from here. I'll throw it back to you to see where you want to jump to, or what you want to go to or push back on.
Well, I think one of the objections, just, and again, this is not a debate. Just to be clear for those who are listening, this is not ever the purpose of Bowtie Dialogues. Is not a debate. It's to listen and learn and to try to engage with positions that would be distinct from my own. But right away, we do have to ask the question, and I know you're familiar with the concept of what's known as the grounding objection. You're familiar with this?
Yeah.
Or maybe you're not. Maybe not. I don't know if you maybe heard it said that way. And that's the question of what is the grounds of those decisions, and upon what grounds are we basing that knowledge of God? Is it simply that He knows me well enough to know what I would do in any circumstance, but yet at the same time is when you get to the idea of this is a feasible thing, this is feasible, that means it's potential. It could have been. And in the question of it could have been, upon what grounds? And I think this comes back to the issue of decree. And so let's ask this question: do you believe that God has a immutable decree?
What do you mean by immutable?
That God determines by decree and I'll try to use your language, because I would say God has determined from all time all things that come to pass, right? Or God has decreed all things that come to pass. You would say, because of libertarian free will, that's not the case. God has not decreed all things that come to pass. But yet at the same time, I've heard William Lane Craig, who is also a Molinist, say that within God's decree, this is how He did it. So it's not eliminating, at least from Craig's position, the idea of a decree. God still has a decree, but His decree is factoring in this middle knowledge. So my question to you is one, does God have a decree, and is God's decree what ultimately determines what will be versus what won't be?
So great question. And so this is where terminology becomes important, because we'll use the same terminology but define it differently. So yes, I think God has decreed all things, but I don't think that the decree is causal. So when we would say that God predetermines all things, or decrees all things, we don't mean that God has causally determined. So if I say I have determined to exercise more and lose weight, I'm saying I've chosen to. So to predetermine, I would say, is to choose beforehand. So has God chosen beforehand which world to create, knowing what will happen in that world freely? Yes. But immediately you see that in the way I've articulated it, there's no causal determination. So human beings would still possess libertarian free will, in my view. So yes, God has determined all things in the sense that He's chosen to create this actual world, knowing what would happen and what will happen in this actual world through the actions of free creatures.
Okay. I'm not sure that I'm following. So because you say we have two different uses of the word decree. How would your use of the word decree different from mine?
Yeah, and maybe so maybe I'm even assuming too much here, and I apologize for that. You know what they say about people who assume that they don't
Yeah.
know what they're talking about. So because it sounded like when you were talking about decree, when I talk to a lot of Calvinists, they what they mean by predetermined, predestined, or decree, they mean it in a deterministic sense, and I'm using that philosophically, a causal determination. But that's why I asked what you mean by immutable, and so I guess decree. When you say decree, or I'll start with this. When I say decree, I mean that God has chosen to create the actual world. Out of all the possible worlds, the feasible worlds God could have created, once He decides to create one, well, boom, everything it flows, and He already knows what's going to happen. And I like how Molina put it, and he was talking. He was responding to Calvin, or responding to Calvinist, if you will, where he's essentially saying, Molina said, which God is more sovereign? A God who can accomplish His will by causing the actions of free creatures, or a God who could accomplish his will through the actions of free creatures? And I would say the latter. So on Molinism, God is still accomplishing his will through the actions of free creatures. So there's no determinism going on in the philosophical sense. He just knows what everyone would do in any given circumstance and gets his will accomplished through that way. So when
Yeah,
God
but
decrees,
here's where I have to challenge just for a second.
please.
You said God gets his will accomplished through the actions of free creatures, but is he not determining what world in which this will happen? Therefore, is there not determinism in the fact that he determined that it's going to be this world and not another world where they would have done something differently?
So he's determined the world, not the actions. So
Okay, but still, but allow me. If he determined the world where he knew this action was going to take place, and he didn't determine the world, like for instance, the world where I would have been, a fighter pilot, like I grew up wanting to be, like, I wanted to be, Tom Cruise and Top Gun, right? That was the movie of my generation, and I don't know how much older I am than you, but that was the movie that like everybody wanted to be a fighter pilot for years. But I realized, one, I was never going to fit in a cockpit, right? Like I was 6'2", I was never going to be that guy, probably, and much heavier than most pilots, right? Like even if I exercise and stuff, I was probably never going to do that. So like God did not. Is it feasible that there would have been a world where I would have been 5'7"? Is it feasible that there would have been a world where I would have been 150 pounds or 120 pounds or whatever? And I think in your position, you would have to say it's not feasible, that's not something that God would have done or could have done.
No, I would say, well, I would have to say I don't know, right? Because I don't possess middle knowledge. So I'm not sure, because God is factoring in not just your free decisions, but everyone else's free decisions. So, for example,
And this is where I think the issue of freedom is. Oh man, I hate to keep interrupting you. So please finish your
it's
thought.
okay.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
No, I love it. I love this. Because had your parents never met or chose to marry someone else, I would say you wouldn't exist. So for you to even exist, God has to factor in your whole lineage, and everything that goes into that. So I'm not sure. And then, right, and I think you might be, at least at this point, or maybe I'm misunderstanding, you might be confusing or equivocating possible worlds with feasible worlds. Is there a possible world in which you were 5'3" and 150 pounds? Sure. Now, is there a feasible world? Well, that would depend on your free decision. I don't know where the fork in the road would have been that would have determined. And when I don't mean causal again, I mean would have decided. It would have been deciding factor of whether or not you would have taken a path where, I don't know. Let's say you got even knee surgery and you made yourself shorter. So I'm not sure if there's a feasible world, but I'm curious as to why you ask if I would have to say that there was no feasible world in which those things happen.
Because again, it comes back. You talked about this, a God who could do, seeing God as the Anselm position of being the ultimate. And but it seems in very much you're saying, well, God is really limited to our decisions. He can only choose from worlds where we decide certain things. And yet we see in Scripture there are places where God overcomes men's wills. And this is, clearly seen in passages like in the Old Testament where it says, at certain points of the year where the Israelite men are going to go away, it says, while you're gone away, that your enemies will not covet your land. Well, the people are always coveting their land, but they're not going to covet your land during this time when you're away, right? So God is able to influence the will of men. We see this throughout Scripture that God
can I
is
interject
actually.
really?
Please, yes.
So when I'm not saying that God can only choose from worlds where people do X, Y, or Z. I'm saying that on my view, given I hold to libertarian freedom, I think that God has chosen to limit himself to create a world in which there are free creatures. God could have done whatever he wanted. God could have created a world in which compatibilism is true, where your everyday Calvinist would hold to a form of determinism known as compatibilism, also known as soft determinism. God could have also chose to create a world in which hard determinism is true, and that we're forced to do everything by God, whether we wanted to or not. So I'm saying God could have chosen whatever he wanted. I'm just saying now here's where Molinists can part ways, because one can be a Calvinist and a Molinist, because all Molinism would require is that God would have knowledge of what free creatures would do. And let's just, to personify here, let's say God looked at all the feasible worlds of free creatures and said, you know what, all of these worlds are not ideal. I don't want to create one of these worlds. And he creates a world in which determinism is true. And so God could have done whatever he wanted, but all Molinism would require here is that God would have knowledge of what free creatures would do in any given circumstance, but that doesn't mean he has to create a world of libertarian free creatures. So, and I was trying to think the other thing you said. So yes, God, I wouldn't say that's God overriding people. And I like the word you use there. You said God influence. Well, right. If God is influencing, I would say that's libertarian free talk there. That's language that libertarians would use. Because on determinism, even compatibilism, it is a soft determinism. God is causally determining things. So influences don't causally determine, they just merely influence, right? There's a difference between a cause and an influence. If it's an influence, it's not a cause. So I agree with the language that God can influence men to not, covet the land, but that doesn't mean he's causally determining them, or doesn't mean he's overriding their will there.
Okay, so when he said it's not going to happen. He didn't say it might not happen or I'm going to influence. I mean, he said this is not going to happen. They're not going to covet. And coveting is a choice. Like, it's a will. It's not just like he's not saying I'm going to put up a dam so that they can't cross a river, so that they can't reach Israel during that time. He said, no, they're not going to do this. And so I think there's more to it than maybe the way I expressed it as someone might say, mere influence. I think God does more than merely influence. And this comes down, I am a compatibilist, at least is the way I understand it. And I know sometimes these words, just like the word decree, sometimes people will take differing definitions, right? Compatibilism, as I understand it, is that God has determined all things, but that does not mean that I don't make choices based upon my own desires, and I do. And this is where I would push back and say, when you say libertarian free will, you said, your hand goes up because you were shocked by the taser. And I would say, well, your hand goes up because that was your greatest desire in the moment. And are your desires from nowhere? Coming back to your soul debate with Matt Dillahunty, which I just listened to 2 days ago, so it's still in my head. Like you said, like your soul is not part of you, not part of your body, right? It's not something scientifically you can measure. You can't weigh the soul. You can't, but you know that it's there, right? Like even though your body changes and your physical cells, replace themselves and all these things over the years, your soul remains the same. Is it your soul making the decision, and is your soul uninfluenced? Is there nothing that influences? And if so, like there are atheists who would say you really don't have free will because you're influenced, and your influences make these choices. You're influenced by your desires and by your experiences and by all of these things.
Yeah. So a few things here.
And I know I threw a lot at you, so I'm not trying to.
No,
it's not
okay.
a gotcha game. I'm really just asking. I'm not trying to.
Yeah. No, argue. I don't mind it. I love it. It's a very cordial conversation. I appreciate it. So going back to the passage you mentioned, are you implying that the only way God could have accomplished that people not covet the land is by causing them to not covet?
No, but I'm saying that's what it. So I have to find the text, but the text that says during this time they will not covet your land.
Right. So I would just say I would hold to the view that God is sovereign enough to accomplish that without causing it, and that's essentially a Molinist view. So and I would also say that we can't. And I'm not saying you are necessarily, but there's a difference between something being certain versus necessary. I can guarantee the outcome of things and make it certain, but that doesn't make it necessarily the case. So determinism requires a type of necessity. To give an example, so when I proposed to my wife, we can say in a real sense that I determined the whole situation. I determined, as a surprise, of course, I determined what dress she would wear, the shoes, the jewelry, what time we'd get. It was like a 4-hour dinner cruise, what time we get on the boat, what time dinner would be served. I chose the meals ahead of time when I bought the tickets. I determined what song would be playing, where on the boat we would be at. I talked to the host, one of the hosts of the boat, tell them, here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna do it at this time. So I determined the whole situation, and I knew she would say yes. Now, I also knew that had I done virtually the same thing, but then, called her a name, spit on her face, and threw her off the boat, she would say no. Now, note that I determined the circumstances. I knew the outcome. I knew what it would take to make her say yes. And let me soften that. I knew what it would take to influence her to say yes, and I knew what it would take to influence her to say no. But in none of these situations or circumstances did I causally determine her decision. So if I can influence a will to a certain way, then surely God can, without having to cause it. So just because something can be guaranteed, or the outcome will be certain, doesn't mean it was causally determined or necessary. And you mentioned compatibilism, but I don't want to go too deep into that yet. I'm more than happy to when it comes to free will. But I would just say that, yes, you act on your greatest desire on compatibilism. I don't hold to that. But I would say that it's, in my opinion, and I'm, take it with a grain of salt, it seems to be a bait and switch, because yes, you act upon your greatest desires, but your greatest desires are causally determined by factors external to and prior to your control. So whatever determines your desires is what's determining your outcome. So back to the taser example, it's almost like saying, yeah, I was determined by the taser, but I also desired to raise my hand. Well, I only desired to raise my hand because the taser made me desire it, then it shut my hand up. So I have issues with compatibilism, but we don't have to go there, or at least not yet. So I'll throw it back at you.
For most people, their finances aren't one big problem. It's 100 small ones. A retirement account from a job 5 years ago. A budget that lives in your head, but never on paper. Life insurance that you meant to look into. A will half finished or not even started. And the longer you leave those loose ends untied, the harder it becomes to move forward with peace of mind. At Dominion Wealth, we walk with you step by step to help you tie it all together. We meet you where you are. We listen. We get your financial picture out of your head and into practice. Then we build a strategy to meet your needs now, prepare for your future, and bless the next generation. We don't pressure you. We give biblical, honest guidance. Let the strategy follow your values and help find the right solutions. If your financial path feels uncertain, let's get together one-on-one and get you on the right track. Book a free consultation today. We are here to help you get your finances in order so you can feel confident about the future. From baptism to burial, Dominion's got you covered. You can find us at reform.money.
Well, let's go to and we can get into that, because the issue of, I think if someone says, if somebody asks me, do you believe in free will? I say, I believe in the bondage of the will, as Luther described it. I believe that the will is bound in sin until such time as Christ is gracious and gives us the grace to believe. But otherwise, I believe in moral agency. I believe men are creatures that are able to make decisions, and those decisions matter, and that those decisions are based upon their desires, so they are responsible for them. So all of these things are true as far as it goes. But when it comes to issues like earlier, you said, well, in this such world, I would not have existed. And again, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth. I'm trying to go back. I'm going back about 4 steps. So if I'm saying something that you didn't say, forgive me. But I think I remember you saying something like, if God determined a world where I would exist. Did you say that, or am I?
That in order for you, and here's what's interesting too, and I don't know your view of the soul, origin of the soul. I don't know if we want to go here, but what's interesting is I think you would agree that as a Calvinist, of course, God, and I agree that God elects people. Of course, we might differ in how we define that, but setting that aside, I think we could agree that in order for God to elect you and save you, He has to first decide to create you, right? And I would say that if your existence is dependent also in part upon your parents, and not to get too graphic, but we know about the birds and the bees, but not just your parents, the day, the time you were consummated, and everything else that falls into that.
The particular sperm made its way into the egg, and I mean, again, not to be gross, but this is all that is a factor, right? A different sperm, a different Keith. Yeah,
different. A lot of things. So then God not only has to determine, and when I say determine, I mean decide to save you. He has to has to factor in all the choices of everyone who came before you, all your parents, great grandparents, etc., and all those things in between, in order for you to exist so that he can save you. So election also presupposes, on the Calvinist view of election, and on mine as well, presupposes that God is also factoring in your entire lineage and history. So when I was talking about you existing or not existing, I was just making the point that God would have to have middle knowledge of all these free choices, if, of course, we're going to assume libertarian freedom.
Okay, so and this comes down to the issue, going back to the word decree, and I hope people don't think we're all over the place. I'm literally, as you say things, I'm thinking of, okay, well, and again, not trying to trip you up, or I'm actually trying to find where we would come closer together rather than further apart, right? Like where could we meet, even if we do disagree on some fundamental or basic things. I think there's some areas where we can agree. So when if you have you have children, I think you said you do.
Yes, sir.
Okay, you saw your first child born. You were there. At least I assume you were there. I was there when my first natural child. I have two adopted children, but my first natural child, I remember being there, and I remember thinking, God created this child, and this child is not just the byproduct of evolution. We know that. I mean, obviously you believe that, but this child is also not the byproduct of, thousands of generations of accidents. This child was determined by God from all creation to exist. Do you believe that statement, or would you say that differently?
I know I could say it the exact same way you said it. We would just have to define what we mean by God determined. Of course, when I say determined or predetermined, I mean he chose. God chose to create. God chose to create a world in which this child came about.
Okay, and I don't think I would fundamentally disagree with that. I think decree. And I've said this before, and I use. You familiar with James Pettigrew Boyce?
Mm-mm.
James Pettigrew Boyce was the first president of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. He was the founder, one of the founders of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. And James Pettigrew Boyce's commentary is actually right over there. He has what's known as the Abstract of Systematic Theology. And in his chapter on the decree of God, I think it gives one of the best explanations of what we mean by the word decree. And I think you would agree with this, even if we disagree on maybe the particulars. He says that the decree of God could be also defined as the plan of God. He says, because any being that is worthy of worship would not do everything that he does without a plan. And the more meticulous the plan, the more, and maybe that's not the word he used. I don't know if he used the word meticulous, but basically the greater in scope the plan, the greater demonstration of his of who he is as God. I'm not quoting this very well, but basically, to say God's decree, you say, well, I say God chose. Okay, but that's still making a decree is a choice. It's a determination to do X rather than not X. And we live in the world of X. We don't live in the world of not X. Even if the not X world exists hypothetically, it doesn't exist actually. You agree with that?
Yes.
And so you would not say, though, that God determined this world as opposed to the other world?
Not causally determined.
And again, that's where I think the word causally is maybe the Achilles heel between us, and maybe that's the wrong analogy, not Achilles heel, but the breaking point. Because if God has so determined the world would be that Judas would do what he did to Christ, and I would say Judas did it because he desired to do it. That's what he wanted to do. I don't think God coerced him, twist his arm, or demanded of his. I don't think God whispered in his ear and said, "Do these things." However, people might think determinism works. I believe Judas did what he did because it's what he wanted to do. But the question becomes, could Judas have done differently? And you would say yes.
Yeah, and I would ask, just to get more of an understanding of your view of compatibilism, why would you say that Judas desired to do what he wanted to do?
I would say Judas had a sinful heart that was had a desire to have the Messiah do something that Christ did not do, did not fulfill his desires for. If I'm answering your question correctly, I don't know the heart of Judas to know what caused him to want what he wanted, but I do know that he wanted. I'm going through sort of the basic things. Obviously, Jesus did not fulfill the expectations he thought Jesus would, and therefore he did what he did.
Yeah, and I don't want to take a shot, but this would be an area of significant disagreement, right? Because I would argue that on a compatibilist view, a Calvinist view, that Judas was not responsible for his desires. And so the reason I said earlier compatibilism in and of itself, not just Calvinism, but just compatibilism itself, seems like a bait and switch to me, because sure, we do what we desire, and sure, you make a choice, but you're not responsible for your desires. So you're quote unquote free to do what you desire to do, but you're not free to desire the things you want to desire in the first place. You're not free to want. You're free to do what you want, but you're not free to want. Your wants are not up to you. And
so you're saying your wants are up to you, that you just arbitrarily decide your wants?
Not all of them, but some of them. I have control. I can rather control my wants and desires. I mean, I think that's what spiritual formation is. It's learning to desire the things of God. But if all my desires are causally determined by factors outside and beyond my control, and I can't do otherwise, and it necessitates my actions, then that's where I think, and without going into the discussion of free will, if we want to stick to the Molinism aspect, but this is where I think that any form of determinism runs into some problematic issues. And again, we don't have to go there, but my point there being is that, yes, I think Judas could have done otherwise. But I also think that Judas's desires were, those desires accumulated on the basis of his free decisions. He wasn't born in a way to where he could not have chosen differently in his life that would have led him to a different path. So, but on a compatibilist view, the first mover is a responsible party of the outcome. It's kind of like a line of dominoes. If I push the first domino, then sure, the explanation for the 100th domino falling is domino 99. But why did 99 fall? Because of 98. And you keep going backwards, and you go to the first move, and you say, well, Eric is the ultimate responsible party for the 100th domino falling. Okay. And yeah, go ahead, please.
This is where, see, even that analogy, your argument for the first mover, and I want to go back to the Judas thing in a minute, but even in your analogy there of the first mover, are we the first mover in our will? Is it? Yes. Not in? Is it? We are.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. See, even in your view, I find it hard to believe that you really believe that there's nothing that has brought about you as a person, Eric Hernandez, who was born in whatever year you were born, in the way that you were born, in the conditions you were born, in the society you were born, the genes that you were born with, that all of that has not participated in the will and desires that you have.
So it's influenced, but it's not caused. So we go back to the word cause, right?
Again, I think that at that point it's really is a matter of hair splitting. I mean, when you say it's influence but not cause, but influence at what point? I'll give you a good example. And this is not a philosopher. Neither is this a theologian. This is a comedian. Okay, I'm going to use a comedian to throw out this idea.
Sure.
And he is a foul-mouthed comedian, and I do not listen to his shows. Just for people who are, well, I can't believe Keith listened. No, I heard him say this on a podcast or something. But so this is just, but his name is Bill Burr. You familiar with Bill Burr?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Bill Burr is a comedian. Yeah, and again, I'm not saying I've never heard him, but he's not one I go and listen to generally. But one thing that he said was he was talking about when he faces God, right? When he faces God at judgment, and he says. He said he doesn't believe in God. He says, but if I do believe in God, I'm going to say, God, you put me in a world with a body that desires these things. You put me in a world with where women are sexy and food tastes good and power is beneficial and all these things. And you've put me in a world of all of these things. And now you're going to make me responsible for the position, for the condition you put me in. How dare you? Now, again, that's the atheist. That I'm not agreeing with Bill. I'm not at all. But that seems to be the argument that's being made against the Calvinist when the Calvinist says we have a sin nature that actually affects us. I assume you would agree that we have a sin nature, or no, you don't?
Depends what you mean by sin nature. And I would agree with Bill Burr there that yes, God has put you in that situation. But I would say you're not responsible for the situation. You're responsible for how you respond to the situation that you're in. And that's the difference. And I would say that that language that's stated is
But you
in
didn't
line
even
with
choose to be
Molinism.
born, like the guy who's suing his parents because he didn't consent to his own birth.
No, but he's
Now
consenting
that's
to
stupid.
continue
That's
to exist.
crazy. That's crazy, right? He's saying I'm suing my parents because I didn't consent to my own birth. They chose to have me without my consent. And again, that's going to get thrown out of court because it's ridiculous. And Bill Burr's argument, I think, is ultimately fallacious. I'm just throwing it out as when people say, "Well, it's my will," and I say, "Well, is your will? Are you the first mover?" And I don't think that is actually the case. I don't think any of us can say that our wants, desires, and all of those things come from us independently of outside influence.
I could agree with that, but it's an influence, not a cause. So, in other words, there's a difference between the first mover of my will versus the first mover of my existence. I'm not the first mover of my existence. God is. Sure, I didn't choose to be born because
Did God determine anything regarding your will?
I don't think so. Not causally determined. No.
Yeah. See, that's where I think that would be tough for me to say that God determined to make me. He determined to put me where I am. He determined to create the circumstances in which I was brought into this world, all of which influences other people's wills, and all of which is
I agree
brought
so far.
about by other people's wills. But yet my will is independent.
It's independent of God's cause or determination. Yeah. That because God
Okay.
chose to do that. I think God is sovereign enough to limit himself. When I wrestle with my son, who's 8, I'm powerful enough to slam him to the ground as hard as I can, but I'm going to choose to limit my power. And I think God in his sovereignty has chosen to limit what he's going to determine. And on my view, he's given us libertarian freedom and has given us the freedom to choose. And I think God is sovereign enough that he doesn't have to cause our will in order to bring about his outcome. So yeah, I'm the first mover of my will because God has decided to do that, to create a world in which that is true. And yes, there are things that influence my will, but they don't determine my will. So there are some desires. Now, here's where we would agree. We should at least agree here is that there are some desires that we could all agree are not chosen by us, right? I have a desire for food, and that's not something, I'm not the first mover of that desire. But note, this desire for food.
Does that desire lead to other things?
It depends. It depends on me. So that's going to be my next point. The desire to hunger is causally determined by my biology. I'm not the first mover of that desire. However,
did God determine your biology?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm just taking a step back because we're going back to what did God determine? So God determined your biology. Your biology determines your desire for hunger. Your desire for hunger. Okay.
Right. So that's where we're stopping. So God's determined my biology. My biology determines that I hunger. And so far we can say, or I would say, is that these things can influence my actions, but they don't determine them. So while my desire and my biology is not determined by me, it's determined by God, and these things determine a desire for food, it is still up to me as to whether or not I act or refrain from acting upon that desire. Now, it has to be the case. Why? Well, because then what would be the point of fasting? The whole point of fasting is that you are choosing to go against a desire that God has even determined you to have. It's a good desire. It's natural. Of course, it can be abused and misused, but fasting is a spiritual discipline that literally you have to choose to refrain from acting on this desire. I dare say your greatest desire. But the point
I would disagree there in regard, and this is from Edwards's argument is really good on this. I'm sure you've read it, but Edwards's argument is no. In that moment, you are still choosing against you according to your greatest desire because your greatest desire in that moment is to fast.
I think, and I think that goes. I don't think. In other words, I disagree with Edward, but not. We don't need to go there for the purpose. Let's pretend I didn't say greatest desire. Let's rewind till I said that. No, it's okay. That was my fault. Nevertheless, it is still up to me whether or not I act or refrain from acting upon my desires. So yes, things influence my will, but they don't causally determine my will. I still have to choose. So no, in that sense, I don't think God is the one determining my will. He's determining the circumstances. And again, by determining, I mean he chose to create. He's to put him in these circumstances. So yeah, I would agree with Bill Burr. I would say if he's complain to God that you determine the circumstances, therefore I'm off the hook. Well, no, you're responsible for the decisions you make. But this only makes sense, I would say, on a libertarianly free view of human beings. Because if you're causally determined by your desires, and your desires are caused by whatever that first mover is, and if you're going to say the first mover is God, then this is where I have strong disagreements with Calvinism, that it seems to make God the author of all things, including sinful decisions. And I'll stop there because I know that was a strong pushback.
No, well, I have two directions I want to go, and we're quickly running out of time here, which we may have to adjourn to a different time and have another conversation. I'm really enjoying this, by the way. I hope you are. I hope this is
absolutely.
Has not been unpleasant. And when you get done, you don't go tell your wife about this great big meanie Calvinist that you met that was hard on you. I wasn't trying to be. Well, two things. I'll ask you two questions. One is going to be about the Westminster Confession. Even though I'm not Presbyterian, I would agree with Westminster 3:1, and I want to ask you if you would. And I'm assuming you're going to say no, but I want to find out why. And so we'll get there in a moment. But before we do that, if God knowingly chooses a world, and as I said, I did have a few questions going in. If God knowingly chooses a world where certain decisions will happen, and you say they don't happen by necessity, you said they're not necessary, right? Is that the phrase you used earlier? They will happen, but they're not necessary.
Yeah, they'll certainly happen. They're guaranteed to happen, but they don't happen necessarily.
Okay, guaranteed, but not necessary. If God knowingly chooses a world where certain decisions will happen, are guaranteed to happen, but not necessary, but they are guaranteed, how is that meaningfully different than determining those decisions, since he did determine the world where that decision would happen? How is there any real meaningful difference if you say, well, yes, you could have done differently, but God chose the world where you wouldn't do differently?
Because you're free in one world and you're not free in the other.
Okay, so that other world doesn't exist, though. You said earlier this isn't the Spider-Verse, right? This isn't the Marvel Cinematic Universe where this other world is out there, and there's a Keith who was 5'6", who was Tom Cruise handsome and was able to fly fighter jets. That world doesn't exist. We don't believe in a multiverse. So if God knowingly chose a world where certain decisions will happen, for instance, I have loved ones who have, and regardless of how we feel about Calvinism and God's opening the heart, regeneration, all that, I have family members who do not believe in Christ. I pray for them every day. I mean, my family and I, we genuinely pray that God would move on their heart. But God knows the world where their decisions will happen, and if they choose to continue to be apart from Christ and they die in that condition, how is that different from determining that? If God determined that's the world that's going to be?
Because in one world, God is giving people the freedom to not be caused by things prior external to themselves. And these decisions that they make are based upon the free decisions they made in the past. So someone who's an alcoholic who may not be able to just quit by sheer willpower are still responsible for their condition, because it's been a number of free decisions that led up to that point. And I can be somewhat sympathetic to a person who's an alcoholic that wants to be different, and without using the word greatest desire, really, really, really desires to not be an alcoholic, but simply can't because their willpower is so weak. I can be sympathetic, but I also know that their free decisions led up to that point. But contrast that with a mad scientist that has so I've used this example, so forgive me for switching illustrations here. Let's say there's a woman who's married, a good Christian woman, good reformed young lady. She's been married. She has 5 kids. She's against adultery. And there's this mad scientist that is in love with her, but she's turned him down all the time. She's even put a restraining order on him. But let's suppose we live in a world in which compatibilism is true, where your greatest desire causes your actions. Well, suppose this mad scientist was able to slip something in her tea that when she woke up the next day, her greatest desire was for the mad scientist. So he successfully does this. When she wakes up the next day, she cheats on, leaves her husband, leaves her kids, cheats on her husband with him, and then goes off and marries a mad scientist. Now, I would say there's 2 ways to view this. She's a victim, or 2, we celebrate her free decision, or we condemn her free decision, but just like, well, hey, that you freely made that. I would say the more natural view is that she's a victim. And yet on a compatibilist view, she's responsible. But I would say clearly the responsible party is a mad scientist here. So I think there's a big meaningful difference in whether or not it's the circumstances and the person is responsible in a libertarian first mover sense for how they respond to the circumstances versus the circumstances plus the action and will are being determined. I think there's a huge meaningful difference.
Okay. Molinism says that God knows what any free creature would do in any possible circumstance. You agree?
Yep.
Okay. What is the grounds of truth of those counterfactual statements before God creates anything? What grounds the truth of those counterfactual statements? That's the way I should have worded it. This again goes back to the grounding thing. I know I talked about this about 30 minutes ago, so we're kind of jumping back a little bit, but that the choice you're going to make is completely grounded in you before you're created.
It's grounded in a sense, yes. And so basically here's where the grounding objection, there's 2, maybe 3 main ways people go. I thought you were going to go a different route, but the route that you're going essentially assumes that there has to be something that corresponds with reality at the moment that these things are known. But I don't think that has to be the case. For example, to give a counterexample, we could say that God knows, we agree that God knows, let's say tomorrow it will rain. Well, the open theist uses a grounding objection and says God does not know the future. Why? Because currently there is no future to where it is currently raining, so to speak, right? It just depends on what view of time. But you and I would both say, well, but God knows it will rain tomorrow, even though there's currently no state of affairs in which it is raining because there is no tomorrow right now. I'd say the same thing applies with any kind of future knowledge that God has. The other way that people usually take it is, well,
but
how
why
can
does God? But why does God know it's going to rain tomorrow?
Because he's omniscient.
Not because he determines it's going to rain.
Yeah. So again, depends on what you mean by determine. God does not cause you to determine that it rained. But because God is omniscient, and I would say here's go ahead.
Well, no, I just think one hair falling from our head, one sparrow does not fall to the ground. And is God merely an observer?
No, God is so everything you said, yes, because God is omniscient, right? So that's why I say Molinism at its core is a view of God's omniscience. And there's really 3 main views of 3 or 4 main views of God's omniscience. You have a Molinist view, a Calvinist view that God knows because he causes, open theist view, God doesn't know the future. Then you have what's called a simple foreknowledge view. And here's how I like to, in one sentence, I think I can differentiate all 4 of them. And I got it from the idea from someone else. Basically, if God doesn't see it or decree it, then he doesn't know it. The person who holds the simple foreknowledge holds to a B theory of time, that time's like a parade and God's on the top of a skyscraper looking down, and he knows it because he sees it. Now, I think that's a lower view of God's omniscience, because God doesn't have to see anything to know it. God is inherently omniscient. I don't hold to a perceptual view of knowledge where God sees by perception. So I think a view in which God is inherently omniscient is a stronger view of a perfect being than God knowing by seeing. But the simple foreknowledge proponent would say, yep, God doesn't see. If God doesn't see it, he doesn't know it. As I understand the Calvinist view, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, it seems to be the case that if God doesn't, or some Calvinists rather, would say if God doesn't decree it, then he can't know it. Well, I think that's also a lower view of omniscience, because now God is limited to only know what he can cause or causally determine in that sense. And the open theist says, well, correct. God neither saw it nor did he decree it. Therefore, he doesn't know it. So open theism, Calvinism, and the simple foreknowledge view, I don't hold to either of those. And I say, well, no, God can know it even if he doesn't see or decree it, because he's inherently omniscient. So on my view, the grounding objection fails because it either assumes there has to be things right now that correspond to reality. I think you and I would agree that, well, that's not the case, because he knows that it will rain tomorrow, even though there is no tomorrow right today, so to speak. Tomorrow doesn't exist. So there's no state of affairs of which, quote unquote, is rain tomorrow. And So if that ground objection doesn't work for that, then we can apply it here, because it begs a question of something that you and I wouldn't agree with. And the other is, well, how can God know it? He either has to see it or decree it. Well, I don't think he has to either see it or decree it to know it. I think God is inherently omniscient. I don't hold to a perceptual view of omniscience. So this is where I think the grounding objection fails, because I think it begs a question of a certain view of God that I wouldn't hold to.
Okay. I said I want to get to Westminster 3. We're an hour and 10 now, so I think we as much as I want to continue that strain of thought, I do want to respect your time. Westminster 3, as you're familiar with, I'm sure, says that God from all eternity did by the most wise and holy counsel of his own will freely and unchangeably ordain whatever comes to pass. Yet so as thereby neither is God the author of sin, nor...
Can you give me that again so I can follow along with you? Westminster what?
This is Westminster Confession of Faith, chapter 3, 1. I could have used the 1689 confession. That's the Baptist confession, which I know we're both Baptists, but they're both very similar. So I mean, the language would not be different in such a way that it would change meaning.
Okay.
So God from all eternity did by the most wise and holy counsel of his own will freely and unchangeably ordain whatsoever comes to pass. I would assume you would say yes, as long as you get to define ordain.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Yet so as thereby neither is God the author of sin, nor is violence offered to the will of the creatures, nor is the liberty of contingency of second cause is taken away, but rather established. So I assume you would agree with that, as long as you were able to define those terms.
No, I don't think I would have to know what they mean by that, but they're now talking about secondary causes. But remember, on my view of the way I define libertarian freedom, is I'm the first mover, the first cause of my will or actions, not a secondary cause.
Okay, so and there it is. There. Okay, that may be it. That may be the best way to end the show, to say, okay, I would say I have a will, and my will is making choices. I've said that already. Like I believe my desires influence my choices, right? But I don't believe that is uncaused. I believe that there is a cause behind that. I believe that.
I believe it's caused. I do believe it's caused.
But you said it's the first cause.
What's caused by me?
Okay. Well, but yeah,
my will is caused by me.
And I would say your will is not by itself independent of anything outside of itself, and not to push too far into that, because again, we don't want to continue the into another hour. But I do think that may be it, though. The second, because you would say there is no secondary cause to your will. You're the primary cause. Or your will is not a secondary cause. Your will is a primary cause.
Right. I am the first cause of my will and actions.
Okay. All right. I think that is going to be a great place to draw to a close. I think honestly that because nothing else is outside the realm of what I think we could at least come to some place of agreement on. I mean, you asked me your 3 questions at the beginning that I said were all true, and then I would ask you. I asked you if it is that this is the world that God created because this was the decision you were going to make, and you said, but it's not causally determined by Him. But you say it's still determined because He determined to make this world.
Well, depends how you define determined. When I say determined, is God chose to create this world. So
God
I
chose,
wouldn't say.
And again, I'm not seeing a meaningful difference there. And you could say, well, the meaningful difference is God didn't cause me to make the choice that I chose. Okay, but God chose the world where you would choose this, and because of His perfect, I would say exhaustive divine foreknowledge. That's the term I would use. You call it simple foreknowledge, but it's exhaustive divine foreknowledge. You would agree?
Is what exhaustive divine foreknowledge?
Exhaustive divine foreknowledge is, as you explained it, God is, there's nothing that God does not know, including the future. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I would, as opposed to open theism, which would say there are things that God cannot know because they haven't happened yet.
Yeah.
We would say it's exhaustive because it's not limited by any factor. God knows everything.
Sure. And just to clarify too, in that world in which God knows what I would do, why do I do it? Well, because I'm in a libertarian sense choosing to do it. Nothing about the circumstances causing me to do it. So In other words, I could have done differently, and I'm choosing to do something, and I'm the first mover of my will. So I think, again, the meaningful difference is that I could have, nothing necessitates my action in that world. If God, let's say let's go back to the mad scientist thing. On a compatibilist view, if the mad scientist successfully puts something in this lady's coffee or tea that gives her the greatest desire for the mad scientist, she has to act on that greatest desire. And if people see a problem with that there, which I think it is problematic, well, then if that's how the world is, and that's what God created, I think the problems remain there. So, and I don't want to go too deep because I know you said we're coming to a close here, but I think that's the meaningful difference. In my view, no matter what circumstances are there, nothing necessitates an action. But if your greatest desire necessitates your action, and your greatest desire is given to you by things outside and prior to yourself, well, then you become a secondary mover, and whatever that first mover is, whatever person that is, that's the responsible party.
Okay. You could have done differently. You said that.
I think so, yes.
You could have done differently. Could you really, though, since this is the world that God actuated, could you really have done it? Is it genuinely possible that Judas could not have betrayed Christ?
Yep.
Okay. All right. So there is that. Man, I tell you, we can do this all day. I think I have to be careful because this is where I think there's an inherent. You're pointing out that what you consider to be the inherent flaw in my system. I think the inherent flaw here is if God determines this world, even if it's based on your decision, he is not choosing a world where you could decide something else. He's choosing the world where you will desire this and you will do this.
But he is choosing a world in which I could decide something else. So two things can be true at the same time. Eric will do X, but Eric could have done Y. God in this world, both are true. And God created a world in which both of those things are true. I will do X, but I could have done Y.
But if the cross is determined by Christ, or determined by God, right? That Christ is going to go to the cross in the fullness of time. All of the decisions that go into that, all of the things that go into whether it's Herod's, flaunting Christ and making fun of him, and Pilate washing his hands of him, all of the things that go into that, all of those you would argue are free will decisions. I would say all those, certainly there were decisions that they made, decisions they're responsible for. I would say they were decisions of their own will. I agree. I don't think we would disagree there. But could they have not been?
Yeah.
So this is where I think the difficulty lies. Could they have not been? Yeah, go ahead.
What most people have issue with here is they assume. So the assumption is if I could have done differently, then God would have been wrong. And then the argument is, well, then that infringes on God's infallible knowledge. The reason that's not the case is because God knows what I would do because he's inherently omniscient and he knows my action. So in other words, I could have done differently. And if I would have decided to have done differently,
could he have actuated a world? Could he have actuated a world where you did do differently?
Well, that would depend on me. That would depend on whether or not I would have done differently. So
there's no world where the Pontius Pilate would have done differently.
I think there is, but it would depend.
Why didn't God actuate that world?
Well, so what I was getting to there is because these decisions aren't made in isolation. So it could be the case that for him to have done differently, a whole bunch of other things would have had to have been different. That's one aspect. Another aspect is maybe there isn't a world in which Pilate would have done differently because of Pilate himself and his character. So remember, that's why I asked you, if you were single and saved, would you marry a non-believer? And if the answer is no, well, then God has chosen to limit himself based on your free decisions. And if there is no world in which your free decision brings about you married a non-believer, well, it's not God's fault. That would be, quote unquote, your fault. And in this case, I'd say that's a good fault, right? It's you're responsible for the fact that you will never freely choose to marry a non-believer. So God can't create a world in which you freely do something that you're choosing to freely not do. So that's just biological necessity. If you're free and there's no world in which you freely do acts, well, then no, God cannot create that world. But that's a limitation you're imposing based on your own free decision, not God. So I don't know if there's a world in which Pilate would have chosen something else. If there was, maybe there would have been an entirely different set of circumstances. Maybe it would have been in a world in which Pilate wasn't in the position he's in, or maybe there's a world again in which Pilate always chooses that. So every single factor, God is so wise and omniscient. He's the only wise God, God above all, that he can factor in every single free decision in every possible feasible circumstance and still bring about his will. And I think that magnifies God's sovereignty more than anything.
Okay. All right. Well, I think I always like to give folks the last word. That was a really good, I think, ending for kind of why you are where you are. If you want to add anything, I'll give you a minute to do that. And of course, we are going to post this on both of our channels, but just in case folks see it on my channel and they want to go and check out your stuff, as you close here with your final thoughts, also give us a little bit of information on how to catch up with you and get with you if you want to.
Yeah, and so for the audience, so this is not something I normally talk about. I think it's important. It's fun to talk about, but I usually don't talk about it when I'm invited, which I really enjoy doing. Especially, thank you. I want to say too for how cordial and respectful you've been. This has been very, I think, fruitful, especially for listeners, because at the very least, it like you say, we're trying to see where do we differ, where do we agree. But my heart and desire, as I mentioned earlier, is I have a heart for the lost. I'm an apologist. Because I'm an evangelist. And so people can go to ehmapologetics.org. We officially started running this nonprofit in January. Again, we're donor supported. Keep us in your prayers. You can go there. You can go to my YouTube channel, just Eric Hernandez in YouTube. I'm one of the few Mexicans on YouTube doing apologetics. And so my website, my channel, you can look me up, social media as well. But yeah, I have a heart to reach people. And I know I have no doubt that you and I right now could meet up and go evangelize and witness to people. And we, none of this would probably come up. But nevertheless, I think they're good in-house discussions for the body of Christ to be able to glean from. But I do consider you a brother in Christ. I, again, appreciate the respect and cordialness in which we had this discussion.
Yeah, and I appreciate it, and I say the same to you as well. And I'm thankful that you came on the show. And as I mentioned to you on the phone, I do hope we get to do this again. Maybe in the future we can talk about your debate on the soul with Matt Dillahunty, or maybe even your taco method for evangelism. I saw that with your video on that as well.
But
so
David
just know
Wood,
yeah. So know that you're welcome back anytime, and we're grateful to have you. So thank you so much, Eric, for coming.
Oh, thank you. And if you ever want to do this again or talk about a different topic, we'd love to. Absolutely.
Absolutely. All right. And guys, I just want to thank you for being a part of the show today, and just remind you that the best way that you can support us is by supporting our partners and by hitting the subscribe button. And if you like this particular video, hit the thumbs up button. And if you didn't, hit the thumbs down button twice. All right, everybody. Thank you for watching Your Calvinist Podcast. My name is Keith Foskey, and I've been your Calvinist. May God bless you.